Hey there. My name's Henry. I'm an organizer, an activist, and an advocate for voting rights and for young people. And I'm here to ask you to save democracy. And to do that, I need you to give one of these or two of these about three simple things. The first is that there are tremendous challenges facing our generation, some of the largest in American history. The second is that we, our generation, are the solution to that problem. And that third, there are a lot of ways to manifest that, but really most of them are voter registration. But first, who am I? Why does it make any sense for me to be here talking to you? Well, I come to you from the Bus Federation. We're a network of youth-led organizations around America, specifically in these places. And since starting in Oregon in 2001, we've been building power for young people by registering tons of voters, over 73,000 in 2012 alone, by doing mad get-out-the-vote work, like when we called over 200,000 people to remind them to vote last cycle. And we win stuff. In Washington, we were the youth arm of the campaign that won marriage equality. We ran campaigns that won online voter registration in Oregon, Colorado, and Illinois. We won campaigns for LGBTQ non-discrimination in places as famously LGBTQ unfriendly as Montana and Texas. And in Colorado, we beat a multinational energy company to take over Boulder's energy grid to make it the first city in the nation to create a publicly owned utility to get off of coal, which was awarded Most Valuable Campaign of 2013 by the New Organizing Institute. So my crew does big things. And who am I? I'm Henry. I'm this guy. I've spent the last 8 years organizing young people to take power in democracy, running voter registration and organizing drives, and advocating for progressive policies as Oregon's youngest and least paid lobbyist. Before that, I was a co-founder of Students for Barack Obama in 2007, and before that, I was a baby. But enough about me. We've got big things to talk about. So thing one, I want to talk to you about young people in America today, about my generation and many of yours. But first, let's do a bit in the way of defining, as in, what the heck am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about our generation, people who are basically our age, maybe 10 years older, maybe 10 years younger, but who basically grew up with a common experience. Our generation is made up of Americans born between 1980 and the year 2000, folks who came of age in the new millennium. Now, people use a lot of labels for us. Some call us Generation Y, which I've always thought is a little dumb and derivative because it's just the thing that comes after Generation X. Some call us the Echo Boomers because we're what happened when baby boomers had kids. But I'm going to call us by my favorite label for us, the Millennials. So here's the deal. Life is hard for us, and it's getting harder. We're the most unemployed group of people in America today. At the time of this recording, unemployment nationwide is 6.1%, which is much better than it used to be. But if you're young in America, that climbs to 15.8%. If you're young and Latino, it's 16.6%. If you're young and Black, it's 23.8%. That's 2, nearly 3, and 4 times the national average. And that's not just the Great Recession that did that. The number of people our age in the workforce has been dropping steadily since the year 2000. The bottom fell out for our generation about 15 years ago, and it hasn't let up since. So that's millions and millions of our friends, and in many cases ourselves, out of work. And economists think it might follow us for the rest of our lives. Now, some of us are making up for that by going to college, which is great. College is awesome. I loved the parts of college I can remember, but it's also getting a lot more expensive. The average college student today is graduating with an incredible, nearly insurmountable amount of student debt, the highest amount in American history. Now, my mom worked her way through college. She worked for summers as a waitress in a diner, and with the money she made from that, she paid for college. Can any of us imagine doing that today? I worked as a dishwasher for the summer after my freshman year, and it paid for like 3 textbooks. The average American college student is graduating with over $33,000 in debt, which is a big enough number, it might be helpful to put it into some context. So say you wanted to pay off that debt by giving up lunch every day. And say you were paying a very reasonable $6 a day for lunch. And say you were doing that every day of the year, it would take you over 15 years to pay off that debt. At which point, after giving up lunch every day, you'd be very skinny. And actually, the average college student with the average debt making the average college graduate salary will be paying off their debt for something closer to 25 years, which is nuts. So the average one of us, before we even start our career, if we're lucky enough to get a job, we're over $33,000 in the hole. Not to mention, we're the most likely people in America to not have health insurance and not be able to afford a doctor if we get sick. A number of my friends wonder if we'll ever be able to afford to buy a house, especially those of us who aren't getting help from our parents. Not to mention, it's almost impossible to think about having kids, because if we can't afford to pay for our own educations, how can we imagine paying for theirs? Now, that's not the way it used to be. 50 years ago, by the time you were my age, I'm 27, you were married, you had a house, and a baby, and like 3 dogs. The world has changed fundamentally in terms of economics, and it hasn't changed in a way that makes people our age more secure. So things are hard, and they're getting harder. And the really frustrating part of it is, all this didn't just happen. Our generation got left holding the bag by people in power. For the last 20 or 30 years, our futures have been mortgaged by people here and here and here. And unfortunately, nobody is coming to save us. There's just us. But all is not lost because we have us. Our generation is going to save the world. It's already starting. We're already part of the next great chapter of American history. Our generation is the biggest, the most diverse, the most educated, the most optimistic, and the most connected generation in American history. And let me say more about some of those. We're big. We're like really big, like really, really big. Let me just say how big. Before us, the biggest generation were the baby boomers. The folks born right after World War II. Most of our parents' generation. And there were so many of them, they changed how America worked forever. They changed American culture, they changed American democracy, from Woodstock to the Vietnam War to 4 decades of elections. Baby boomers have by and large run the show because they were just such a big generation. But compared to us, they and every other generation is tiny. Let me just show you how tiny. Now, at its peak, Generation X, the generation that came right before ours, had 48 million people. The baby boomers at their peak had 78 million. Now us, there are at least 95 million of us. 95 million. It's just an unimaginable number of people. Every day, 13,000 new millennials becomes eligible to vote. That's 4.75 million new eligible millennial voters every year. Now, that doesn't mean all those people can vote yet. We still have to register a lot of them. And we'll get to that in a minute. Let me just show you how that's grown. In 2008, a big year for millennial voters, we were 23% of the eligible electorate. By 2012, we were 29%. By 2014, this year, we're 34%. By 2020, we're going to be nearly 40%. By election day this year, 1 in 3 eligible voters in America will be a millennial. 1 in 3 eligible voters will be a young person. That's never happened before. This generation, just by sheer size, can and will rewrite the history of America, and soon, within this decade. And that's not all. We're also the most diverse generation in American history. 40% of our generation are people of color. And according to research from some smart folks at Pew, we're also much more likely than other generations to face questions of race and identity head on. We're more likely to see all our futures as linked. As a generation, we see that our lives and our livelihoods are inextricably bound together. If somebody across town from us suffers, so do we. Now, some people in other generations have felt that way too, of course, but most of our generation feels that way. And that's a big deal. We're also really smart. We're the most educated generation in American history. Despite all the odds against us, we're going to college and graduating in record numbers. So we can't be stopped. And if we're organized, we provide powerful support for stuff people in the public interest care about. We believe in the power of the collective. We believe that we're all in this together and that we have a role in looking out for one another. We believe that government can do good in people's lives. Not that it always does, by any means, but that it can and that it should. We're the only generation in America today who believes that government has a bigger role to play, that it should be doing more to solve problems, which is a big deal. And that plays out across all kinds of issues, from making college more affordable to creating jobs, to protecting the rights of women and people of color, to addressing climate change, to fixing the healthcare system. We believe that government should be doing more to solve problems. And this year, there will be more eligible millennial voters than ever before. So we're a big deal. And if we show up, we can be the deciders of what happens in American politics. But if we stay home, it can be a disaster. So what's it going to be? What are we going to do? We've got all these people, but we're still being left out and left behind. And way too many people in power are treating us like this. Well, I have a proposal. That we need to be taking matters into our own hands as a generation of engaged people to get the rest of our generation voting whatever way we can. In a democracy, voting is our point of greatest leverage, especially considering how little money we have as a generation. And our influence is already being felt more and more every year. But we're not done yet. There's still something in the way. Our greatest challenge lies in voter registration. Now, I imagine most people watching here have heard of narrative that young people vote a lot less than older people. Huh? Well, it's not precisely true. Now, when we're talking about eligible voters, the folks who are eligible just walking around on the street in America, there is a pretty big difference between older voters and younger voters, nearly 20 percentage points. But once you register everybody, that difference shrinks to almost nothing. So nearly the entire difference between older voter turnout and younger voter turnout is voter registration. This simple card is keeping us from near equality and a lot more power at the ballot box. So why is that? Well, some people will make an argument to you that time has a lot to do with it. That the older you get, the more used to the system you become, and the more you figure out how to register and where to go and whatnot. And for most of us, nobody ever taught us where or when or how. Now, education budget cuts have all but destroyed public civic education in America. But I'd like to make a different argument to you. That something more nefarious is at work. Because you see, it wasn't always this way. For decades and decades after this country's founding, we didn't require voters to pre-register. When only white men could vote, no list of voters was required. People could just show up and vote. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that government started requiring voter registration to keep low-income immigrant communities from voting. Because one thing we know about human behavior is that the more barriers you put up to a thing, the fewer people who will do it. So by asking for citizens to proactively go to a public building, usually run by the machine, often staffed by racist or xenophobic white folks, you can keep those citizens out of the process. Now, Jim Crow Southern governments quickly followed suit. Requiring pre-registration of voters was phased in at about the same time as the poll tax. And since racial discrimination is not and was never confined to one single location, it became law of the land coast to coast, and it still plays out today. If eligible voters could simply vote in America without pre-registration, it's pretty safe to assume that governments across the country would have radically different governments. And on top of that, very few places make it truly accessible to register to vote. For starters, in many cases, people were never told they had to register to vote. Some of us were lucky enough to be raised in households that taught us the rules of that particular game, but lots of people, maybe most people, didn't. So you're starting with a basic information problem. Then, if you want to register to vote on your own, you have to figure out where, which is challenging if you've never been taught. You also have to have the time and the privilege to get to a government office during regular business hours, which if you work full-time hourly or a few jobs, you know, what many, if not most, low-income and middle-income people in America are doing, it's pretty darn tough. Now, it's nice that some states have online voter registration now, but of course, that only works if you have access to the internet. And on top of all that, we need people to know when to register. Even many people who know they need to register and want to assume they can register at any time. Nearly 90% of young voters don't know accurate information about their voter registration deadlines. In fact, in 2008, a year that a lot of people voted, 6 million people didn't vote because they missed a deadline or didn't know how to register. And we've got to remember why that is. It's not because they're lazy. Most regular people just don't have the time or energy to figure this stuff out. They're too busy with work, lots of people working 2 or 3 jobs to support themselves or their families, or they're studying to hopefully get a good job someday, often while working a job or two, or they're taking care of their families. And lots of patriotic Americans just don't remember there's politics to care about until they see campaign ads everywhere, which, by the way, is almost always after voter registration deadlines. So whose job is it to make sure people can get registered and make their voices heard before it's too late? Well, it's ours. It's up to you. It's up to me. It's going to take me and you and everyone we know. So what do you do if our generation is getting hosed, if outdated predatory laws are erecting huge barriers to democracy, if many of the voters most impacted by the decisions of government are being left out, and millions of people just don't know how to get registered? Well, I have 2 words for you. Clipboard. People talk a lot about technology and political organizing, but this right here has always been my favorite because it's cheap enough for everybody. And when we get into the day-to-day of this thing, it's easy to forget how magic that is. Here we are facing giant institutions designed to oppress us and the people we care about, built intentionally by rich white men for years and centuries. And here we are with no money and few connections, and we can upend it all with this. When it comes to breaking down the walls between us and justice, it can feel pretty overwhelming. But here's one of those rare circumstances where that dumb joke is true. How do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And even in this system that was designed to exclude, we found a way to undermine it because we're crafty. And we can turn the tables using the old pre-registration system to undermine it. We can grab forms from these offices, which we were never supposed to do, and go out to find new voters in person, face to face, going out and bringing people into democracy one person at a time. And it also means we become part of one of the most inspiring pieces of American history. Voter registration is a core piece and one of the most important stories we have. Protecting and expanding the right to vote is something Americans have fought and died for. The struggle for voting rights is the story of America. The right to vote is our most essential right, and it's taken countless people hundreds of years to get it. It's the story of our better angels fighting against our greatest demons in the most powerful, beautiful, heart-wrenching way. And people paid for it in blood. It's been exactly 50 years since Freedom Summer, when young people from all over America risked their lives to register voters, to then change their lives, to register voters wherever they could find them, one at a time, to rewrite the history of America at tremendous sacrifice. Now, what we do today is not nearly as brave, but it is joining their history. It's honoring their work and their sacrifice, following in their footsteps, and carrying on their great work still left undone. And as long as we have a system that excludes people, until we change the laws of America to automatically register every eligible citizen to vote, our mission is to chip away at that old giant wall, brick by brick. And lucky for us, our bricks are people with faces and stories and power. And we get to welcome them into that power. We get to empower a generation, sometimes a bunch at once, sometimes just one at a time. And with this little card designed to limit us, we can provide people with self-determination. We can change people's lives. We can change how they impact their government. We can give them personal power and agency, which in a democracy is everything. So I want to say thank you to everybody for sharing this time with me, to all of you who have been out there registering voters, to those of you who just decided you're gonna go out and register voters. And I want to say thank you to everybody for all the great work that's still to come. So thanks again for listening. If you want to find out more about the Bus Federation, the network of organizations that I work for, go to busfederation.com. And if you want to get involved registering voters in your community, send me an email at henry@busfederation.com, and I'll hook you up with a great organization doing this work. So thanks again for spending this time with me, and keep kicking ass out there. Thanks.